Okay, am I on? Great. Welcome to the Small Acreage webinar. Today we're going to be talking about raising sheep and goats. My name is Jennifer Cook. I'm the Small Acreage Management Coordinator for the Front Range in Colorado. And sitting with me today is Dr. Nancy Erlbeck, who will be presenting our webinar today. But before we get started, I'd like to go over a few things. First off, our webinar is made possible by Colorado State University Extension and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. And I'd like to extend a big thank you to today's webinar sponsor, Moose Mountain Ranch. Let's see, behind the scenes we have Ruth Wilson, who's the IT person for CSU Extension. So if you have any IT issues, you can use your chat box in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen to communicate with her. So you can hear me, but I can't hear you, so we'll be communicating with each other via the chat box. Before we get started, I would like to put up 2 poll questions, so I'll have Ruth pop those up. So you can use your mouse to answer the poll questions just so we can measure your knowledge before the presentation, and then again we'll do polls after the presentation to measure how much you've learned. So the first question, please rate your knowledge of sheep and goats before this presentation. And the second question, do you currently own sheep or goats, just so we can get an idea of who our audience is so Nancy can speak to you appropriately. So while you're answering those, we'll keep it up for a few more moments. I'd like to also mention that there is a handout that you can download, and I emailed it to most of you, but if you haven't received it or haven't printed it out, you can use the link in the chat box to open up the handout that Nancy will be referring to throughout her presentation. So it looks like we have pretty much everyone answered. So Ruth, can you just screen save that for me? And Ruth will go ahead and open up Nancy's presentation, and I'll go over and hand it over to Nancy. But before I do, let me introduce her appropriately. So Dr. Nancy Erlbeck is an animal nutritionist who's taught at CSU in the Department of Animal Science for 15 years, prior to becoming Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at the college. In her free time, she is a consulting nutritionist at the Denver Zoo, and she and her husband raise 8 rare wool breeds of sheep on the Colorado-Wyoming border. So she comes with us with lots of experience and knowledge. So let's all sit back and enjoy her presentation. For the format for today, I'd like to ask that you hold your questions for Nancy until the end, and we'll leave 10 minutes or so for question and answer. So thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. All right, I added 2 breeds during Jennifer's introduction. I actually only have 6, but that in itself is a lot of sheep. We have between 80 and 100 breeding ewes. To merit having a breed, they usually say you need about 25 ewes per breed, so I'm pushing that. So let's talk about Newcomer's Guide to Sheep and Goat Basics. It is my hope today that you can catch just a smidgen of the enthusiasm that I have for this topic. To give you a little bit about my background, I'm a pig farmer's daughter. I come from Iowa, grew up on the land, not only with hogs, but with cattle, everything but sheep. Go figure that. Trained as a ruminant nutritionist, working with cattle and sheep. However, over the years, I have become more of a comparative nutritionist. I use these slides to illustrate not only the pigs that I grew up with, my training. I have the dairy cow with my training. I teach companion animals, illustrated by the dog and the hedgehog on the bottom. I have a soft spot for the alpacas and llamas on the lower right-hand corner of the screen, and that little wallaby up on top taking a stretch is because of the sabbatical that I did in Australia. And again, another soft spot for marsupials and the Australian mammals. My husband and I are both owners of the Annaroon Sheep Company on the northeast of Wellington on the Wyoming-Colorado border. I love this slide. So every presentation I give, I have to find to work it in. If you are a goat person and you think, my God, she's not giving any time to goats, well, that's probably because I'm playing like being a goat. So I'm the wolf that's really a goat among the sheep there. But I will talk about both as we go through the presentation today. It's a perfect time to look at small ruminants. There seems to be a changing lifestyle. among our population, and more individuals are interested in getting back to their roots, if you want to use that verbiage. But the changing lifestyles, people are interested, though they may not have the luxury of growing up with animals, are interested in learning. And I applaud all of you on this, or all of you that listen to this, for trying to increase your knowledge. I like this little bug question guide, because if you leave today and you have more questions than when you started, I'm successful. Because this is a critical thinking presentation. I want you to think beyond. And the questions that I have in the printout that Jennifer sent out, forgive me for being a teacher. Once a teacher, always a teacher, but they're putting questions rather than giving you the facts. And if you can't answer those questions as you listen through the presentation, I'll have failed my job, or just ask and we'll help clarify it for you. Even though I saw on the poll that some of you have some knowledge, I'm going to emphasize that this presentation is going to be the beginning fundamentals. And so for those of you who had indicated that you don't have any sheep, it'll be a perfect place for you to stop or to start. I want to go ahead and advertise just a little bit for the small-scale livestock workshop that will be held October 15th, and I will be also presenting there. And if anyone is going to be attending that workshop, we're suggesting that they watch this first, because I'm going to take off at that presentation where this leaves off. The first slide I have here is researcher selected animal. Now, as a comparative nutritionist, I do know that this is not a goat or a sheep. But sometimes if you don't watch all of your points, you may not know exactly where you go, and you need to research your animals before you start so that you have some working knowledge. And I'll kind of illustrate why I think that that's important. You need to learn, you need to observe animals. If you don't have the animals, find somewhere that you can observe them. Or when you first bring them into your life, you need to watch them, so that you know what's normal. And that is a way the animals can communicate with you, because you immediately know if something's wrong. I walk into the pen and one ewe is hanging off to the back, her head's down, her head should not be down. She had a twine string wrapped around her neck and her foot. And so I picked it up. Had I not caught it, the animal would have died. And though I hate to admit that there was a twine string or a string that binds the hay laying in my pens. It is also very important that you research your animals so that you can manage your flock, manage your goat herd without emotion. Here is a young friend of mine, and she's petting a wee lamb as it's laying in the cornstalk bedding there, and she's very emotionally attached to that animal. And I love my sheep. I love the animals that I have. I love the camelids that I have. I love the horses. But I have been doing this long enough that I learned that I have to maintain a separation of my emotion and what facts are facts, so that I can make wise decisions and for the health and well-being of my animals. It is important to learn behavior. Maybe I'm a Temple Grandin protege. She's a very good friend of mine. But learn the behaviorisms of your animals. And I use this, I have one of my caracal ewe lambs, or ewes, laying on a water tank. And if I can find my little pointer, I found the little pointer. I'm learning technology, so bear with me. I applaud for those of you who are attending the webinar. But this water tank here has a hole in it, so we can't use it, but we put it upside down, and the sheep lay on it, and they like to run and drum on it. We had taken Madonna, this little ewe's name, to another pasture, and it was very quiet for a few nights. And when we brought her home, she began her drumming to let us know that she was here. Weird? Yeah. Normal? Maybe. These lambs are laying here. It is a winter morning. The sun is shining, and they're all laying. Though they look dead, they're sleeping. They're laying in the sun, soaking up the rays. You'll find with young lambs and with young kids also, forgive my tendency to talk just sheep, but you'll find that they run and jump and play, particularly early in the morning and late in the evening, and then they plop down and sleep, and that's normal. This one is an issue that I deal with all of the time. See the two young lambs sitting in the bunk. Now, if you have the bunks that are rounded in the bottom, they work quite well for an adult that may not jump up into the bunk, so though some of my adults will also. But if you were to have a flat bottom bunk that is not built strongly, the animals could fall through, get caught, get hurt, tear a leg, rip a leg off. And so be cognizant of the fact that they're going to do this, and that's normal, no matter if you like it or not. And you'll have to keep the bunk clean because they will defecate and urinate right on top of the feed. Here is the young animals that are jumping around. Let me go back here. When I put my facilities together, their behavior to run up and jump, hey, king on the mountain. I know that young kids are even more zealous than the lambs. If there is a little building, they will be on the roof. And they will bounce from building top to building top if given the opportunity. And so it is normal animal behavior to play. Animals can be embarrassed. All of my ewes, all of my sheep wear blankets other than my primitive breed to maintain cleanliness of the fleece because I have a hand spinning market. And this young man just has his first blanket and he's very embarrassed about it. You will find that many of the sheep maintain those familial ties. Here I have Gypsy and Gemma. They were born two twins, two Wensleydale twins. And even today I have both Gypsy and Gemma. They were born 4 or 5 years ago, but they still, where you find one, you're going to find the other. And often you'll find their mother Priscilla. They still stay in their little family units. So those who indicate that sheep don't know, recognize one another has definitely not worked with sheep. And I'm making the assumption that goats are the exact same way. And that's because me? Because the experience that I've had with the goats that I've been around is they are much more intelligent than sheep. And I have had goats get out of pens and jump back in the pens before you can see, and you wonder how in the heck did that happen. My grandmother was laying out papers, cleaning a basement that had been cleaned, and the goats came out and took bites out of all of her magazines and jumped back in the pen. So me? Working with goats tends to stress one's patience, I have to admit. Here I have the picture. You can let me use my little pointer right here. And see the top of his head? This is one of my rams. One of my, it's actually a caracal ram. I have a blanket on him because I just sheared him and it was still kind of cold. But the point being is they were fighting. And it's nothing for rams to back up 100-some feet and just come charging at each other and hit. And if you're in or near the vicinity, it's very easily for one to get caught up. And here's a group of my rams. I would encourage you that if you are a beginner, if you've never been around livestock, and if you have no experience, do not attempt working with rams on your first go out. And the same would also be with the billies. Going back to my rams right here, I can move in and around my rams, but I usually carry a pitchfork handle. And that is particularly during, as we go into August, September, October, as they start going into rut. They are short day breeders, and probably within a few weeks now, my animals are going to start getting ruddy. And I don't work with my rams alone anymore. When you have 20-some rams in a pen, it's not safe. And again, the same with the billies. This picture here, actually, I took when I was visiting a park, and again, the intelligence of the goat. Notice the young lady is scratching the top of the head of the billies. That on any male animal is a no-no. You do not rub the top of their heads. And my young rams are taught the only time I can touch them is to go underneath their neck. I stroke them underneath their neck if I were to stroke them at all. You never stroke the top of their head because for goats, this is a dominance issue. And this young lady here was their caretaker and was having a problem managing them then. So if you're starting out, stay away from the intact males. And probably one of the good things if you're starting is to find a mentor. Work with the mentor to ask questions. I helped deliver a set of lambs at midnight one night with one of the young ladies who had bought sheep from me. I put this slide here, and my letters have kind of moved around, but the question I have is, will your vet take care of them? Can you afford vet care? Before you purchase any sheep, no matter what breed you decide, before you bring goats into your life, you need to find a vet before. Don't just make the assumption that they're automatically going to take care of your animals. That's not true. It's not going to happen. You'll find that many young veterinarians in particular, and even some of the more experienced, they have small animal experience and have never worked with a sheep. This last lambing season, I had a young veterinarian come out and donated her time because she couldn't get a job as a small animal vet because of the surplus of veterinarians around Fort Collins, and she wanted the small ruminant experience. So first question, do you have a vet who will take care of your sheep and goats and is familiar to help you recognize what needs to be? And can you afford them? I'm a wee bit biased. I have been around animals my whole life. I have taught about animals. And I believe fervently that if you bring an animal into your life, you must take care of that animal. And if you cannot afford the veterinary care, if they were to get sick, you really shouldn't have the animal. Enough said. Next slide. Use common sense. Listen to what the animal has said. This goes back to learning what's normal. Because if the animals are not acting normal, something's wrong. They're always, all of the animals I've ever been, no matter what the breed, and this includes elephants and zebras, all animals follow routine best. As long as you're in routine, they feel much more comfortable. If they act different when you're in routine, you need to be checking out why. So listen to common sense and what the animal says. So what is a ruminant? Some of you may roll your eyes, but for those of you who may not be familiar with this verbiage, it's important to start with the basics. Both goat and sheep are ruminants. This is an incredibly simplistic diagram that I use in many of my classes. There are three eating types, one being the carnivore, one being the omnivore, and one being the herbivore being the plant eater. Notice the size capacity of the herbivore, and that's because of the need with a plant-eating animal. There is a synergistic need for the microbe population to help break down the plants that they consume. There is no mammalian enzyme to break down cellulose that's found in all of the forages that we feed these animals. This is a diagram of a cow. I know it's not a sheep or a goat. Let me go along with that, but it still illustrates the little green arrow, moving it back, you'll find the rumen is the largest compartment that you can see on the diagram. Sheep and goats both have rumens, perhaps not the size of a cow, but very large compartments that are filled with anaerobic bacteria, as you see in this slide. These are the bacteria that break down the cellulose, that break down the fiber to supply the animal the energy. The animal does not get energy from the feed without the use of with the microbes. These are rumen papillae. They are about a half inch, a quarter to half inch long in goats and sheep, and they line the inside of the very large compartment of where after a goat or a sheep consumes the food, it goes into this rumen and the microbes start to break it down. The importance of these papillae is as the microbes, remember there's this need relationship, this synergistic relationship between the sheep and the goats and between the microbes. They have to have each other. The sheep and the goats provide the house and the microbes provide volatile fatty acids. The volatile fatty acids are absorbed through these papillae along the length of the papillae so that the sheep or the goat can use the energy. And again, so whenever you're feeding a sheep or a goat, always keep in mind you're feeding the bugs. You're not feeding the animals. And they must have a forage. Here is a hay. This is a grass hay, example of a grass hay. Other examples might be pasture, if you have pasture that's available, or alfalfa, but we'll be talking about that in a little bit. It is critical, particularly as the cost of hay this year is incredibly high. There is an interest in many to go ahead and perhaps feed alfalfa pellets or alfalfa cubes because of the lower cost factor. I would encourage you with all my heart to make sure that there is long stem hay available for your goats and for your sheep. And I define long stem hay as a minimum of 2 inches. And they're needed for what we call a scratch factor. And that scratch factor scratches along this little cartoon that I have here, scratches those papillae to maintain surface area for the animals to absorb the volatile fatty acids being produced by the microbes. So when do we feed grain? Everyone wants to know, when do we feed grain? Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but right now I'm going to emphasize if you feed too much grain. And if you feed too much grain, you develop a disorder called acidosis. In this slide, notice the papillae. They're already starting to mat down, not only because there's a shortage of long stem hay to provide upright papillae, but because of the grain that's being fed, and it's starting to mat down the papillae. The microbes are breaking down the grain. The grain breaks down much easier than the forage would, and it lowers the pH significantly. A normal pH of a rumen in a sheep and goat is around 7. When it gets to less than 5, you're in trouble, and your animal will develop acidosis. This slide is taken of a sheep when I was in graduate school that got into the wheat, ate too much wheat. The animal died. Upon necropsy, you could see where I rubbed my hand, and the papillae just ran away. It just came off of the surface wall of the rumen because of the low pH. Here's another ram, another ewe ram that got out at the same time, and the pH actually caused a discoloration of those papillae. Acidosis causes severe pain. Monitor the amount of grain that you feed, and only feed it when it's necessary. And this is the abdomen cavity of one of those animals that died with severe acidosis. You'll notice animals, if they eat too much, their backs are up, they're in pain, labored breathing, veterinary care needs to be sought immediately. And as a point, if you go and if you buy grain in a mill or someone that works with livestock feed, they will not make the mistake of grinding grain real fine, as you see in this slide, but will prefer with the coarse ground. However, if you are feeding a lot of grain, it's very easy to get some of these fines, and the finely ground grain is more apt to cause acidosis because of a greater surface area of the particles of the grain. So we're going to switch slightly, and let's talk about the animal itself and what you can expect as you start a flock. We're going to talk about physiological status. Physiological status is the life stage of the animal. And I've broke it down into several points, and I'm going to actually go to the bottom first and talk about maintenance. If you're interested in just having a couple animals to chew on the grass of your yard, to eat the weeds around, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, you will be feeding them to maintain their body weight. They will be at maintenance. However, if you're going to start in a production setting, you're going to have young growing animals after they've been bred and through lactation. So when would you feed grain? What are the highest nutrient requirements? Again, going down to the bottom, you'll notice that maintenance is not highlighted in blue. Oops, where's my little pointer? There it goes. It's in the yellow, and the yellow indicates more of a lower energy. We'll move on up to lactation. I break down lactation into early versus late. Early lactation, we have a high energy need, high nutrient need, and this would be a time when we feed grain. During gestation, we divide our gestation into 3 trimesters, approximately 150 days roughly for both sheep and goat. The first 2/3, let's say a first 100 days, you do not need to feed them any different than you were at maintenance, and that's why it's in yellow. However, the last 1/3 is when you will need to feed grain to increase the energy concentration for the animal, and I will illustrate that in a little bit. I'm not going to talk about flushing in this talk. I left it on the slide to make it complete, but flushing is something that I will be talking in the Boulder workshop. For growth, I have neonate versus early versus late growth. Young growing animals, I tend to feed my young lambs until they reach around 100 days. And unless I have an animal that is struggling to maintain weight, I usually don't feed grain after that. Now, I think you'll kind of find these slides of interest. These were done in the 60s. It was an Australian research where a ewe was humanely harvested and lowered into a tank of liquid nitrogen. And what the researchers did is cut down across the abdominal cavity of the animal, so we had a cross section. And this large brown area here is the rumen. Remember that very large space that I indicated to you that is needed for microbial fermentation because digestion of the fiber is slower. So this is a non-pregnant animal. Here is a slide with animals that are 88 days, or with an animal that's 88 days of 150. So she's over half and was in mid-semester trimester. You can see the embryo, and here's rumen capacity. So she's half, 88 days, and you don't need to feed her any different because the embryo is just there. 112 days, so now we're started into the early third. And anyone that's been around pregnant animals, this is the time they're going to start getting hungry. And they'll probably start eating all of those alfalfa stems. They will eat anything that you give them because they're getting hungry. And look at their rumen capacity. Here's the embryo down here, but look at the rumen capacity. And now is when you need to start providing those extra nutrients and perhaps a small amount of grain. Here is a slide, is 103 days of 150-day gestation. This ewe will probably lamb at 145. The little green arrow is on the rumen. She's actually carrying twins. There's 2 embryos there. If you had not been feeding her earlier to maintain the body condition that you're seeing up along in here, she would probably develop ketosis. Ketosis is a state where the animal is requiring more energy. In this case, for these developing fetuses, 90% of fetal growth occurs in the 3rd trimester, and she doesn't have the rumen capacity to manage it. And so keep those pictures in mind. It might be very helpful. One of the questions that I always get when I talk to beginning producers is, how old do sheep and goats have to be before they can have lambs, or goats have before they can have kids? Well, let's talk about sheep first. Suffolk and Hamps, these are the typical meat breeds that you'll find, many of the club lambs, and most producers are going to, if, for example, the lambs were born in January and February, they'll be exposed in August or September to breed, we call that their maiden year, to lamb as a yearling. I work with Lincoln Long Wools. That's one of the 6 breeds that I have. Also, one of the breeds that I have are the Wensleydale and the Teeswater. And with these 3 breeds, the long wool breeds, I have bred them in their maiden year. Sometimes I'm successful. I find that there are more complications. With these 3 breeds, particularly the long wool breeds, I find it more advantageous to maintain and breed them so that they lamb as 2-year-olds. So you'll find there are breed differences, and you need to do your research to determine what the difference is. I put this slide here, this last fall, we were AIing some of my sheep, Wensleydale and Teeswater, because of the hoof and mouth disease in the UK. We are not able to bring those animals directly into the United States, so the only way that we were able to now have the breed here that we can go back and look at the pictures of these beautiful animals is to bring the semen in. And I am now, with the Wensleydale, I am now up to full blood, which is above 96%. My Teeswater, I'm up to around 80%. But because of the uniqueness of the cervix and the reproductive capacity of sheep, you will find that we cannot artificially inseminate sheep like we can goats or we could cattle. And it's actually a surgical procedure where we put the animal in a table upside down, and this is their bottom right here, and it's an intrauterine laparoscopic surgery. And so it's expensive, but it's the only way we can bring the breed in. This breed here, the Ramondale CVM, a fourth breed that I have, is a breed that I am very comfortable. It is the only true U.S. breed, and I'm very comfortable breeding them in their maiden year to lamb as yearlings, and they do very well. Will all of them conceive in their first year? No. But many producers, including myself, are starting to select, in addition for the fleece characteristics, for reproductive efficiency. And it's something that I keep in mind. Caracal breed is the primitive breed that I have. The fat-tailed sheep, it's more of a hare breed, almost more of a goat. Augustina here just had a set of twins. They're very beautiful twins. And these I also breed in their maiden year. Something that you need to know about caracals, they'll also breed out of season. So short days mean nothing to caracals. They will breed if and when they want. In fact, several of my caracal rams will breed ewes over the fence. And my ewes just back their little bottoms right back up and say hello. So if you want a very promiscuous ram, bring in a caracal ram. So they will breed out of season. How old? How old can the ewes be? And then I'll talk about does as far as how long can you breed them. This ewe right here, though she was a year or so younger when I took this photo, she is now 14. And this last year she actually raised twins. You'll think she looks a little funny, and maybe she does to some. We go back to the genetic diversity. She has the real short La Mancha ears. I don't know of but one other breeder that has that La Mancha ear, and her young Cheppy also had those little La Mancha ears. But I thought that I would throw that in there. Most of my ewes, my long wools, my CVMs, they're very protective until they're 6 or 7. After that, I manage them on a one-by-one basis. The primitive breeds seem to go a little bit longer. And I think that's also true with goats. And for everything that I have found with goats is that they will breed till 10 or 12, but the older they get, the harder it gets to them. And some people will actually retire them after that maybe 10th or 12th year. So hopefully that'll give you an idea, kind of your reproductive capability. Let's talk a little bit about facilities. You can look down. This is the barn that I built up at Annaroons on the Wyoming border. It is a 24 in width and 36 in length. It is only enclosed in one corner here. There is a tarp right there. When I started and put up my first facility, actually let me go ahead just a little bit. When I first put up the barn for the first time, I did just a half of a barn. And I had a 24 wide and 36 long, and I brought in 12 sheep. I put in my first pen. It was the length, 36 in length, and 100 foot long as an area. And over the years, and again, here's the barn, I kept expanding, and now I actually have 2 Quonsets that I use for more housing space, and we'll be putting 1 or 2 more Quonsets in. Point being is start small, keep expansion in mind, look at the space that you have, and so kind of think ahead. Let me go back. This is before you even talk about building, one needs to keep in mind several other points. And I'm going to go down to zoning here first. When I started looking for my acreage in the early 2000s, I found that as long as I was within 10 miles of Fort Collins, I could not have a sheep. I could have a horse, but sheep were considered to be livestock, and goats were on that same page. Sheep or goats were not allowed. I also know that if you do find an area that doesn't have those restrictions, and if your neighbors are going to be close, you need to check. The neighbor to the north of me actually had to get rid of all of their sheep because the neighbors didn't like the noise. The neighbors didn't like the smell. When I drive in, last night I drove in quite late because we had an event here on campus, and the sheep just all started baying and greeting me. And here it is close to 10 o'clock at night. And I'm sure that was very enjoyable for my neighbors if they go to bed early. So keep that in mind as you locate your animals and with the numbers that you have. You need to provide them shelter. You need to provide them sufficient space. and shade when it is really hot, as we see here in Colorado. Coming up top now to the predators, you need to keep in mind the predators that are of concern. I live north of a wildlife area, and so the coyote population is incredibly verbose. I've had coyotes sit outside of my bedroom window singing to me in the night. And we have an occasional mountain lion come through. And so it is very important for me not to allow the predators to get to my sheep, and particularly when they're small. We have also eagles, both the bald and golden, and you never know with some of the small ones what might happen. I find the best preventative medicine against predators is fencing, and I use a 5-foot cattle panel around the perimeter of my fence. I use cattle panels for now because I can keep rearranging my pens for what I need. Maybe eventually I'll go permanent. I doubt it. This just allows the flexibility. But all of my sheep come in at night with the llamas that I use as guardians. Everyone comes in at night to protect the animals. And the animals actually will come in by themselves. It's part of their routine. And I maintain that routine with them to keep them safe. Predators, the top slide here is of actually a dingo in Australia, had killed a couple lambs on one of the borders in the bush. Down in the bottom here, there is a dog right there. You'll see the Pyrenees taking care of a flock. My preference is right now is I use llamas. I have 2 llamas, and I will actually be bringing in an alpaca to use as guardians. Now, if you do bring in the llamas, concern that you need, here's Yama Llama, and I know he has bad teeth, but he is worth his weight literally in gold. And that's something to be said when you can go to Centennial Sale Barn and buy one for $2. But you need to have a very territorial animal to make as a guardian. He is a gelding. Now, it's very hard to tell the difference between an intact llama and a gelded llama. An intact means they still have their testicles. And that's because their testicles are not even the size of a quarter. And unless you really get up close and personal, you can't tell that they're intact. I was sold a llama on the premise that it was gelded and it was intact. And it wound up trying to, it was with my rams, and it actually killed one of my rams trying to mount it. If they're with ewes, they will keep the rams from trying to breed the ewes because the llama says, these are my ewes. They will actually service the ewes. The ewes will conceive, but will abort within a few weeks. But then you'll lose that breeding season. Keep that in mind. So use a gelding or a female as a guardian. And I have the 2 that are literally worth their weight in gold. So moving ahead on the slides, here is Yama with several of my Wensleydale lambs in one of the Quonsets, and it was nice and cozy, and I had the front all nailed up tight. And what I wound up doing is I treated them too well. Animals do better when it's cold and they can get out outside in the cold breeze. We as humans think we're cold and the wind is cold, and I'm just going to make it as tight and cozy as I can. It can be to the detriment of your animal. I had used lime for years after I cleaned the pens, and during lambing I clean the pens at minimum once a week, if not more frequently. And before I lay down clean straw, I always distribute lime to help destroy pathogens and to keep it clean before I bring other animals in. When you do that and the animals urinate on the straw, the urine and the lime create a toxic gas. And what I wound up doing is this set of 5 Wensleydale lambs that you see on the slide, I lost 3 of them to intense pneumonia because the gas burnt their lungs. So right now, I'd rather have it open than cozy. In fact, if I drop down a tarp and it's too tight, I'll have condensation along the sides of the barn. They don't need to be that closed in. Make sure they have plenty of space. This is one of my lambing yards. You can see the ewes and their lambs, and they have actually much more space than what you see here, but it kind of gives you an aerial view. In enrichment, we talked about the lambs are bouncing up the bottom bales, and they bounce up to the big bale, and then they jump down and go up and around and do their little dancing. Here is a friend of mine is with her goats. She always had stumps. They would actually jump up on that stump. Go figure there. And here is one of the does and her 3 little kids. They play with the tires. Because of the intense intelligence, and I'm going to say it that way, though I may be, or sneaky nature, forgive me if you're a goat person, they need the mental stimulation to keep them busy. It would be to your best interest. So let's talk about management, daily care as we draw down to the end of this. Animals need to be checked at minimum twice daily. If they are lambing or kidding, they need to be checked more often. And then we usually, at our facility, check them on the hour. But you need to check them twice daily, particularly with the sheep. The sheep tend to be much more timid than goats. I have had sheep jump up on a fence and get their head caught in a small crevice area between a bunk and a fence and hang themselves. It's very easy for them to get into trouble. They get underneath the feeder and get caught and can't get out. One of the most common things that I see is the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, even in winter. And they put their heads through the cattle panel, the combo cattle panels, and they just can't back out, and they get their head stuck. And I can hear when they're calling when it's a distress call, because you know what's normal. So check them at least twice a day. Feeding times, there's difference in philosophies because they are ruminants. They are capable to eat once a day. If you were to feed all of their diet to them once a day, they would probably do well. Goats better than sheep. Goats probably need the twice a day over the sheep. I tend to feed them twice because I'm there anyhow, and maybe it's my nurturing need. But water, always. Clean, fresh, always have water available. And I'll talk a little bit more about water in a minute, but let's talk about records. One of the most important things, and if you're not started, now is the time to think about, you must maintain flock or herd records. And this is the way I manage it. I use an appointment book. This is this year's appointment book. And this is an actual page in February when I was lambing. And let me give you some of my hieroglyphics and how I keep track. For example, 926. Let me get my little arrow right here. 926 is a Lincoln ewe lamb, her name was Cranberry. She gave birth, I think that was around 5-something in the morning. She has a face. It's not exactly a smiley face. It's a normal smiley face. That means I was there and she needed a little bit of help. She had a ram, so you see the R. The ram lamb weighed 10 pounds, and the flock number was 127. 807's name is Marcy. She gave birth at 6:33 p.m. She had a ewe. She had a ram. I had to help her. She had a sad face. Their weights, 11.5, 13.5. Their names were Dustmop and Desmond. I had an intern, little Monica, named my lambs those days. And their flock numbers are 128 and 129. There was one happy face up here. Contessa gave birth to 2 rams that morning at 8:34. But I provide as much information. I think you're kind of understanding any information that you can go back and track. Also, anytime I treat an animal, it's recorded here in my book. And that includes all of my animals, include the horses and the camelids and even my 3 dogs, not my husband, but everyone else. CDT, Clostridium tetanus, I treat. This is a 3-day treatment. I treated 112 to 118, so 113, 114, their flock numbers. And I banded their tails, and I gave them their numbers for the day. So they had their injection. They were tagged with their flock number, and they were banded. This bottom line tells me that I had 3 lambs that had entropium. And so there were 3 of them that we had to provide an eye surgery for to help prevent. These animals are marked and will not be used in a breeding situation. And you wouldn't know that unless you kept good records. So I can't emphasize keeping records strong enough. Let's talk about feeding these animals. Nutrition is a puzzle. It depends on your management. Depends on the behavior of the animal, the behaviorisms I talked about, how much money you can pay. It talks about a lot of things. And let's go through this fairly quickly, but your feeding costs are going to be greater than 70%. And this year, feeding costs may even be a little bit higher with the cost of forage that we're seeing. Keep in mind those anaerobic bacteria. Watch your animal's condition. And when they have large fleeces, or if you have a Cashmere goat, Angora goat, and with their large fleece size, you may have to get hands-on. If they're a very thin animal, we give them a body, emaciated, we give them a body condition score 1. If we give them a body condition score 10, frankly, they're just a wee bit obese. We're shooting for around a 5 body condition score, not too fat and not too thin. Be a hands-on manager. This is an animal that died of obesity. You do not want this to happen. Obesity compromises an animal. It costs you too much in feed that is of no value. They have problems lambing and kidding and other physical disorders, metabolic disorders, greater incidences of twin lamb disease and ketosis. Ketosis where the animal requires more energy than she's able to consume. So I'd emphasize that goats and sheep need forage. So what kind of hay do I feed? Well, I'm going to keep this portion of the talk very simplistic, and we'll spend more time in the Boulder County presentation, but right now I'm feeding grass hay to maintain animals. I have alfalfa featured here. Alfalfa is a legume, which means that it is high in nitrogen, ultimately protein, and calcium. I have a first cutting and second cutting. The second cutting is something that I would use for animals that are in late gestation that need a little bit more energy. There we go. And I also use third cutting alfalfa to creep feed my lambs. I get them started because it's high in protein and it's high in calcium. It's a perfect creep feed for them. Testing your feed, if you can buy together in a group so that you as a group can test your feed. Otherwise, you may have to use book values, but again, that's something I'm going to emphasize more in Boulder. I put this picture here because goats like trees. In the southern part of the United States, they often use them to remove brush and trees. They will stand up on their hind legs and eat the brush and trees. Keep that in mind if you have trees in your facility, but they will do anything for browse. They love it. And because of the interest in using more holistic, non-chemical weed control, goats and sheep are phenomenal for weed control, and something, again, I will emphasize more in Boulder, but goats in particular are able to consume plants that there's no way any animal should be able to consume. Hay storage, it must be stored. I have a couple pictures. You may not be able to facilitate or even need a big hay shed that I have illustrated in this picture. Maybe just a small lean-to with a tarp, or tarps as I use in my production. Now we feed animals according to physiological status. Remember I told you physiological status is life stage. And you can see I have a 154-pound animal, a ewe, calcium and phosphorus requirements. In maintenance, you compare maintenance requirements to the first 15 weeks, a slow increase. We're not going to talk flushing, but then looking at gestation versus lactation. The S and the T is for singles and for twins. Notice that the ewe feeding twins or the doe feeding twins or triplets or quadruplets is going to have greater nutrient needs, and you may need to separate them out. So when do you feed grain? I have a group of young growing animals here during those high nutrient demands that we talked about earlier. Late gestation, if they're carrying multiple in singles, or in early lactation. And if they're feeding more than one, they need more groceries. Here is a doe up ready to be milked. She definitely will need grain as she is lactating and producing beyond even that early 8 weeks that you'll see. And in young growing animals, I usually feed them until they're 100 days of age. During their dry period, when goats and or sheep are not in a reproductive cycle, pasture is sufficient. Sometimes pasture is too much if you have green plush pastures. Right now I'm feeding just grass hay to meet their nutrient needs. So do not let them get fat. Only meet their nutrient needs for that time. This ewe's, Shannon, is very pregnant. She had triplets in this slide. One of my Wensleydale ewes. She can't eat enough at this point. And so I had to make sure that I had fed her sufficient along. I made sure she didn't get fat, and so she's perfect, and she delivered for me 3 beautiful lambs. So the single versus the multiple, ultrasounding might be a good idea, depending on your management, and if you have the capability of ultrasounding your animals. It costs from $2 to $3 an animal, and that way you can feed those animals carrying singles and those carrying multiples separate, with those carrying the multiples having a higher nutrient needs too. And here's one of my one of the Toggen birds with or Toggans with her kids. All ewes should be able to feed very carefully the single lambs, but now and then, as in this one, Mona was her name, she's one of my Teeswater ewes, had a set of triplets. And you think, yay, triplets! But if you're not familiar with the anatomy of a sheep, they only have 2 faucets, only 2 nipples. And so here my husband is bottle feeding. And as I see him scratching his back here, I'm reminded our brief conversation on rams and on billies. Never, ever, unless the genetic warrants it, but I would caution, if at all possible, use a bottle-fed baby for a ram or a billy, because they've lost fear of people, and they're going to be lethal. They're going to be very dangerous because, again, of that, they're imprinted on people. Oh, and we get very creative in our, I promise you, I'm not feeding beer, and I'm not feeding Kahlua to my sheep. And here I have a slide with the kids, and they have an artificial mama up here, putting the milk, and many can eat at once. Right there, you can see all those little nipples, all those little mouths. Some people actually put ice in here to keep it cold, to make it last a little bit longer and slow their consumption down. It is more efficient to feed a lamb directly than to feed the ewe, to make the feed into milk to feed the lamb. And so I use a little gate here, called a creep feed gate, where the kids or the lambs can get in and out. I have a grain or a little bunk, a little trough here with grain, and here's their playground. Actually, they have a very large creep feed area. This slide depicts it a little bit easier, but an area where the lambs or kids can get in and eat. I try use alfalfa for the most, maybe a little bit of grain a couple times a day. They grow much more easier to get them on solids. Already at 3 days of age, they're trying to eat alfalfa leaves. If you have really rich alfalfa with a lot of leaves, keep an eye on your little ones. If they start getting distended bellies, you might see some of the animals bloat a little bit. We've seen that with several of ours. Do you use block salt or loose salt? Obviously, from these salt sculptures that I have, we use block salt. I do not feed minerals from horses, cattle, or pigs. Yep, there goes my little arrow. Because mostly of copper. And with sheep, we need to be concerned with copper. They are very susceptible to it. There are a few exceptions, particularly with the long wools, but that's beyond the scope of the class or with the webinar for now. Just don't feed any other mineral except sheep mineral to sheep. And here is a goat telling you, I am not a sheep, nor am I a cow. And goats eat less mineral supplement than cows. Goats are not as susceptible to copper toxicity, are not as sensitive to copper as sheep are, but they cannot be fed the cattle level. And feeding a goat mineral, which because they eat more of the supplement, it would be more concentrated. And so taking care of the species differences. Let's talk about water. Where I live, I get a little bit of snow and it gets a little bit cold. I use heated waters. This water right here is actually called a goat waterer because it's made for goats so they don't crawl on top of the waters, and it works phenomenal. I took this picture on my Palm Pilot. It was minus 33. It was actually minus 39 that morning, not good for lambing. And if you didn't have a heated water, it would have been miserable. Let's briefly go through a few products as we're reaching the end of our line. They were cheaper than buying gas for the mower. I thought this was appropriate due to lifestyle changes and using more sheep and goats to control weeds and in pastures. Lambs. The first time I had quads, I was ecstatic, but remember 2 of them were mine to feed. Fleeces, here is one of my Wensleydale fleeces. Beautiful fiber, as you'll see, can be made into a variety of projects. In this slide, I also have some pelts and rugs that were made from the fiber of the animals, or meat. We have a very strong meat market. Going into goats, you'll find that goats are the universal milk donor. In this case, we have an elk calf drinking on a little nanny, and we have a lamb nursing on a nanny. At the Denver Zoo, when we have an artiodactyl or a deer species born that we don't know how to feed initially, we use goat's milk. It's perfect. So we have milk, we have meat for the goats, we have the boar goats on the lower right hand, increased interest in goats, and particularly with goat meat, fiber, and companionship. I couldn't find my horse goat picture. This is one I actually took at one of the alternative livestock fairs where we have a goat with a little zebra. Goats make wonderful companions. And with the goat meat, the cabrito, some slides that I took in an old market down in Guadalajara in Mexico. And you can see the goat head up on the left-hand quarter. Very briefly on health, work with a veterinarian. I can tell you what I do. I learned by doing what I do, by working hand in hand with the veterinarian. If you can't afford it, you may think about waiting. I did use that slide, is watch your feces of the animals. It's very important. This is a loose feces. It's loose feces because I fed too much alfalfa with leaves, so they got loose. This is a normal pellet right here. But you can learn a lot about health of the animal by watching the feces. I have a strong parasite control for worms. I do test for worms, do fecal test. Again, I'll talk more about this in Boulder, but I can only emphasize working with a veterinarian. I do vaccinate for Clostridium perfringens, overeater disease, as I had indicated in my little record book. This is a lamb that died from enterotoxemia, which is Clostridium perfringens, overeater's disease, the overgrowth of Clostridia causing the death of the animal. And I vaccinated 3 days, 3 weeks, and 6 weeks. We'll talk more health in Boulder. Let's quickly go to economics as we go down on the clock. Remember, feed costs greater than 70%. Things that you may not think about, registrations, purebred animals, going to the shows. Here is extra cost. I'm bathing sheep to go up to Estes Park for the show, my white sheep. And now and then we get lucky. We'll win. Transportation cost. Anytime you haul animals, you need to have the vet cost, the health papers. Any male animal over 6 months needs a negative B-Ovis test. Fuel costs going up. All costs you may not think about. What are you going to do with the surplus animals? You can't keep them all. Sooner or later, some of them have to find a new home, and you have to make some hard decisions. Manure disposal, I use this slide because we push all of our manure here. It's not a true compost because we don't turn it, but it's heated and then distributed in the fields when it starts to get brown as it is. Oh, you don't have the picture. Well, we'll talk very briefly. Manure, you need a system to manage your manure. Why the slide's not coming up, don't know. Last picture, I put this up here because when I first started and the winds blew in the Wyoming winds coming into Colorado, you can see the tumbleweeds piling against my fence. The force of the wind behind the tumbleweeds snapped all my T-post off, and I had to refence. So use common sense, listen to what the animal says, and I will take questions.
Thank you very much, Nancy. That was great. She has lots of experience to share with us. So we're just at 1 o'clock, so those of you who have to leave, go ahead, but we're willing to stay on for, another 5 or 10, 15 minutes to take questions for sure. Before we start taking questions, though, Ruth, would you pop up that poll question so so you can just answer these quick questions before you log off. So please rate your knowledge now on sheep and goats after the presentation. What species do you want to learn more about, and what areas are you most interested in learning about? So this will just help Nancy kind of develop her presentation for our workshop on October 15th that hopefully many of you can come to and join us. So we'll leave these up for a little bit longer, and then you can go ahead and start doing your questions. It looks like we already have some questions coming in. From Glenn, what are your thoughts on using goats to weed with the use of portable electric net fencing?
Okay, I see, Glenn, that you asked that question. It's a wonderful idea. It alleviates the need of a person being there with dogs. I've seen herds of up to 1,000 goats moving. The one particularly coming out of Wyoming, they bring up to 1,000 goats at one time using dogs and people to manage them, but there's always someone having to be there. If you're using the portable electric net fencing, it works just fine. It's amazing with what the goats can do. They'll eat a death camos when it is weak and limpy in the morning, if it's or in the afternoon in the sun, and they'll just take a couple bites. And when it's really turgid and the toxins are higher, they don't. So yes, definitely. I don't find the net fencing works for my sheep because with my heavy fleeces, they've already learned how to dash under the fence. The next question, will the Boulder workshop be on the web? I have to ask. And I'm getting no. It will not be. I'm sorry, Diana. Do you add electrolytes to your water for sheep during the hot weather? No, I do not. But I always make sure, Nansen, I think is your name. I always make sure that there is salt available and that they have mineral, free choice mineral at all times. But I do not use electrolytes. The exception may be is if I'm handling the animal a lot in a show situation, I may use electrolytes at that time, similar to what you would do with other breeds. How would my Jacob lamb have compacted droppings? I'm not sure. As long as they have available water, it may be an individual animal's characteristics, but usually if it's in the winter, you may try heating your water because just heating it sufficient to melt the ice, they will consume more than if they have to eat around an ice cube. In the summer, I would be very surprised that they would have compacted droppings. So, Ellison, I can't really help. You may have to seek veterinarian on that one. Can I have goats next to a greenhouse, or do you think they will eat the glazing unless I fence it off? I have no idea. I would probably put a fence around, or maybe even one of the portable electrical fences around initially, and maybe try and experiment one. I do know that I have tried to use slabs, and those are the long pieces that they cut off of logs when they're making lumber, and they will eat the bark off of them. They will eat off, but I've had no problem with eating paint or anything. So I guess you're just going to have to try it. I would fence it. Are there types of grass in particular you have found successful in feeding your sheep? Thanks for the presentation. You're welcome, Chris. What I find when I was in the Midwest, I preferred brome. Here, what we're feeding is orchard and timothy is what we're feeding most of. It is a must. Is it a must to separate breeds, especially for breeding? Now, that's a loaded question. I have some crossbreds. If you put in one ram, it's going to breed no matter what breed, color, how she looks, the ram will breed the ewe. Though I have had some ewes that when I put a young ram will decide that they don't want a young ram, they want an experienced boy. And they'll refuse them, but I do separate them if you want to maintain your purebreds and to know who the ram is, who the dam and the sire is, you will need to. It depends on your system. What type of compost systems do you currently have? I'm working with CSU to start building up my compost. Right now I use the Bobcat, push it out of the pens, and it sits in a pile until I put it into the manure spreader to spread on the fields. I would like to create a compost area where we would turn it and maybe add a little bit more and have a little bit higher quality, but I'm not there yet. You mentioned using an alpaca as a guardian. Are they territorial and aggressive enough to successfully protect your sheep? I will tell you, Isaiah, in a few weeks. I'll let you know. Right now, I am using llamas, and I'm very, very happy with them. I am bringing home an alpaca that is very territorial in its current home and has created actually problems for the people that are keeping them. And so I'm going to bring this animal home to live with me and gradually introduce him to the sheep. We'll see. I have been told that alpacas work very, very well if you have a territorial alpaca. I've also used burros. I've had burros and their babies, but not all burros, again, will make guardian animals. I had one little Jenny that was a perfect animal until I weaned her baby. And then she thought that the sheep must have been responsible for the loss of her baby. And now if I put her with the sheep, she tries to kill them. But I like to keep the burros around the perimeter, particularly for mountain lions in my area when I'm lambing. I will not have them in the pens, but I'll have the animals or the burros around the outside so they keep the cats away. When dissecting a rumen, Donna asked, what should the contents of a healthy sheep looks like? That's a good question. Thank you. I'm a ruminant nutritionist, so that's a wonderful question. When you open it up, you will know what you're feeding. If you're feeding green alfalfa, you will have green, they will have chewed it as they chewed their cuds. They will probably be broken down into about a ½ inch, ¼ inch, and even smaller pieces. What they're eating, you'll see. It will smell bad, or what we see is bad, but it's not a spoiled smell. It looks like what they're eating all chewed up. I have heard that forcibly weaning a kid is opposed to allowing them to continue to nurse as long as they want results in more surface area when they're older. True or false? Peter, I have no idea. I don't know any physiological response why. What results in the surface area is volatile fatty acid production. And if you're forcibly weaning that kid, you're forcing the kid to wean itself. And by then you would, they would have to have the volatile fatty acid, so I can probably understand the reasoning. I'm a true extrovert, I think, as I talk, so bear with me. I don't think that what you're gaining would be sufficient. I would not forcibly wean a kid if I didn't have to. Would you recommend an alfalfa grass mix or just grass for lamb growth? Allison asked, it depends the age of the lamb. I use alfalfa for my young'uns until they're weaned, and even up until about 4 months of age, 16 weeks of age. And then what I'll probably do is I use alfalfa in the morning and grass at night, or if you have the mixed feed, that's how I do it. And that's based on the physiological requirements, those life stage requirements that we have. I hope that's a sufficient answer for you. Is there a breed you would suggest for a small school farm? I'm going to assume that we're talking sheep. And it depends what you're trying, what the small school is emphasizing. If you're emphasizing meat, then I would go with the Hampton Suffolks, the market animals. If you're going to do just production and want fiber, CVMs are smaller, gentle with their fine wool. We have some of the long wools, the Lincolns, that are kind of dual purpose. Some of the primitives are neat. Caracals are the fat-tailed breeds. The Jacobs, our sponsor is a Jacob breeder. It depends what the school farm is trying to do. In grazing a pasture with sheep and goats and cow, what order should they have access to the pasture? I'm sure that there's literature on this. I use sheep and horses, and I flip-flop them in order. The sheep and the goats tend to eat the weeds early, so if I had a choice, I would bring sheep and goats in early because they eat the weeds when they're smaller. And if they have a preference, they won't eat the grass, they'll eat the weeds. And then I would follow up with cows. Okay, and I know that there are 2 typing yet, so I'm waiting, Diana and Heather, for you.
So while we're waiting, Nancy, sorry, I'll just pop in here and advertise our next few webinars coming up on poultry, August 29th. Alpacas and llamas August 31st, and swine on September 29th.
Okay, do you have a recommendation for a good book about goats? Yes, but I don't remember the name. It's in my office. So Diana, what I will do is I will get the name of that book and I will send it to Jennifer and she will email it out. Heather, is there a good way to estimate weed-eating pasture space for small goats? Oh, I'm sure there is. Do I have it? No. It would depend on how dense the weeds are. It would depend on what other fiber or plants are in there. I don't know. When we do measuring stocking rates for cattle, I'm thinking back to my range nutrition classes, we had to estimate the biomass that was available, and so it depends. I can maybe see if I can find some of those formula for you, Heather. I'm sorry I'm not giving you a more clear answer. Do you have literature recommendations for sheep? Yes, but they're in my office. I will too send that to Jennifer. But going back to the recommendation for weed eating, it depends how much grass is in there, and if they eat the grass, pasture space, it depends on a lot of things, but specifically the biomass, Heather. You're welcome, Heather.
We'll just hang on a few more moments if you have more questions. I forgot to mention that this webinar has been recorded, or is being recorded, and we'll post it on the Small Acreage Management website through CSU Extension. And I'll send out everyone the link so that you'll have that available for yourselves to rewatch or send it to your friends. Looks like there's still a few people typing, so we'll hang on.
Did any of you catch my enthusiastic bug? Great seminar. Thank you, Nansen. That was nice. Oh, we have Maggie typing. I love this little chat. When is the next seminar and where?
So I'm assuming you're referring to the workshop that Nancy talked about. So if you are, that's the livestock workshop. That's at the Boulder County Fairgrounds, and it will be on October 15th. It'll be an all-day event. It's a Saturday, so it's 8:30 to 4:15, I believe. And then if you were talking about the other webinars, then they're just like this. They're available online, and you can register for those. I'll actually send the link out to everybody in case you're interested, the link for registration for those.
We have one more person typing, it looks like. Are there any upcoming workshops about beekeeping?
Beekeeping. You know, I don't have any on the books. I know that there are, if you're in Colorado, there are some Colorado Beekeeping Association, and there's a Highlands Beekeeping Association, and I believe there maybe even is a Boulder County Beekeepers Association. So the three of those groups do workshops and do mentorships and presentations all the time, so you can find them online and make some contacts that way. But I will keep that in mind, though. Maybe we'll do a webinar on beekeeping.
And I see one more question. Hello, Dr. Kelsey. How are you? Good to see your voice. The question that Kelsey asked is, we are curious about offering the Clostridial vaccinations at 3 days. We normally recommend a month before they lamb and then 2 more when they are older. Kelsey, thank you for that. I did not mention that I also vaccinate the ewes with the Clostridial vaccination, the CDT, 30 days before lambing, so that there is some passive immunity passed to the lambs. I have tried to go 3 weeks or more weeks, more time, but Kelsey, what I'm finding in my flock is that the animals, I lose animals if I don't do that 3-day. And so I know what the books say, I know what the recommendations say, but I know what's working in my facility. And that's why I emphasized, again, work with a veterinarian so that you can set up the system that works for you. It just, I can't wait longer, even though I vaccinate ahead of time for the passive immunity. Thanks, Kelsey.
And we had another question from Maggie about the Boulder County workshop. So go on www, maybe Ruth can type this too while we're talking, www.ext.colostate.edu/SAM/livestock. And that's the website where you'll find the link to registration and the brochure and information about the workshop. Excuse me. All right, it looks like we're out of questions. So hopefully we'll see you all at the workshop on October 15th. And thanks again, Nancy, for your expert presentation.
I loved it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Have a great day, everyone. Thanks.
Bye-bye.